afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Interoperability in Action, How SLDS Transforms Education Data Management. My name is Erin Faye Caesar, and I work with Project Unicorn, and I will be your host for this webinar. Today, we will be discussing the fundamentals and layers of the SLDS and how interoperability ultimately supports efficient data management and accurate decision-making processes across the education domains. Today's webinar will go as follows: an introduction to our speakers, an overview of the State Longitudinal Data Systems and Interoperability, SLDS Resource Series. Then we'll hear from Georgia Department of Education and South Carolina Department of Education. We will also have a Q&A portion, so please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A chat at any point during the webinar, and you can find the Q&A button between the chat and participants icon in the toolbar below. And finally, we'll have closing where we will just go over everything discussed and how to keep up with each project. Today, we are joined by Sarah Edson from SETDA, Daniel Ralia from South Carolina's Department of Education, and Nicholas Hanville from Georgia's Department of Education. We will hear more about their roles and their connections to the SLDS in a moment. This webinar is supported by Project Unicorn and SETDA. And for those who don't know Project Unicorn, I'll be giving a quick overview. Project Unicorn is an initiative of Innovate EDU and an effort to improve data interoperability in K-12 education. We're a coalition of national education organizations that aim to create a community of innovators who make the broader case for secure interoperability by determining shared priorities, collaborating with school systems and vendors to understand its importance, and creating a demand-side push for data interoperability through partnerships. We're funded by the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Some resources and support. Some of the things we provide are publications, webinars, technical assistance, and we have additional resources like the Interoperability Pledge and the Interoperability Rubric, which is all related and centered around interoperability. Now, for the big question, what is interoperability? Interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. It can transform teaching and learning by giving teachers the information they need to succeed and enable innovation in classroom practices to help guide students. And now that we've defined interoperability, we're going to learn more about the State Longitudinal Data Systems. And in that, I will hand this over to Sarah.
Thank you, Erin Faye. Thank you, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are joining us from. I'm so glad that you were able to come together for this morning's session on statewide longitudinal data systems. As Erin Faye mentioned, my name is Sarah Edson, and I am Director of Projects and Initiatives with SETDA, formerly named the State Educational Technology Directors Association. And SETDA works very closely with Project Unicorn and Innovate EDU. And I had the privilege of stepping into the role of facilitator of an SLDS working group in the last calendar year. We got together about monthly between July and December of 2023, and we were able to form a small, nimble, flexible group of experts from the field who could respond to legislative changes, other activities happening, come together, join for discussion, identify where there's some gaps and opportunities to produce resources for the field. And I got to be at the center of it with some incredibly smart people, several of whom are joining us today. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes to sort of set the stage for our conversations around statewide longitudinal data systems. So just a quick nanosecond of background. I spent 13 years working at the school level at a secondary school that was grades 6 through 12. I was both an academic technology specialist, school administrator, and classroom educator. Prior to that, I worked for the state of Connecticut for several years. So I have seen and worked with data at play at the school and the district and the state level. So I recognize the importance, the opportunities, and some of the challenges that folks are navigating and facing in terms of advancing progress with leveraging data in education. But to prime our brains for the conversation, I just wanted to lob the question out to the group. What stories can education data, and I would say good quality education data, help us to tell? I know the folks joining us today wear a number of different hats from a number of different organizations. Some people, you've been working in the field forever, and this is a deep area of expertise. For others, you're coming to this conversation with a newer lens about the intersection of data and interoperability. So if you wouldn't mind, I would invite you to add to the chat just a quick keyword or phrase to indicate where do you see data, education data, helping us to capture stories. You could think about an individual student. You could think about a group of students. You could think about a collection of students and teachers within a school building. You could think about the district level, other levels. But just to get our brains in gear, just go ahead and throw some ideas into the chat. What can education data, what kinds of stories can this data help us to tell? Right off the bat, I want to thank the folks that took the initiative to get the ideas flowing. There's some great examples in the chat. If you haven't opened up the chat box yet, I would encourage you to. Also, we know that students are more than just individual scores or individual data points. So if you want to challenge your thinking, you can also chime in with what data can't tell us. There are limitations to the stories that data can tell us. So wherever your mind is with this, keep the ideas flowing and invite you to continue to brainstorm in the chat. What stories can good education data help us to tell? And maybe where are there limitations as well? Okay, great. I'll invite you to keep brainstorming again to kind of get our brains into gear. So statewide longitudinal data systems, as Erin Fay set the stage, are systems that are designed to collect, store, analyze, and help us use a wide range of data. It can relate to student performance, school information, demographics, and other relevant indicators. And because we have this powerful data that can help tell stories and can help inform decision-making and resource allocation, it can also inform policy, right? It's really, really powerful stuff. But in order for data to have the impact that we want it to, we need to make sure that the data can flow from system to system, from person to person, from group to group, to be able to empower them to make their decisions and to do this really critical work. Next slide. So again, interoperability. We know that education can be a very siloed experience. You have teachers from one classroom to the next, not always able to observe or know what's going on door to door. There can be disparities between departments, between school buildings. You can have different regions within a state that have very, very different experiences. So education can be a siloed experience, and data can also be siloed if we're not intentional about ensuring that there's interoperability. So interoperability is, of course, the capacity for different information systems, devices, and applications to let data flow, to be able to access, exchange, integrate, and cooperatively use data in a coordinated manner, both within and across boundaries of an organization. So SLDS, statewide longitudinal data systems that are interoperable, ensure the seamless data flow between classroom, district, and state levels. And as mentioned earlier, this can inform decision-making and personalized education strategies. Next slide. And thank you again for the great ideas that continue to flow in the chat. So very briefly, before I pass it off to the real experts here, just want us to be thinking about these different layers, right? So first, we're going to begin with the classroom layer of data. If you think about a learning management system, one that keeps track of grades, completed assignments, activities, et cetera, student information system that can track attendance, geographical location, other demographic tools. You have assessment platforms that measure student progress and give insight into advancement within a grade, across grades, within a school building, and between buildings as well. So even on the classroom level, right, data is powerful and can tell some rich and powerful stories. Having data standards that let data flow between parents, between educators, principals, support staff, and other authorized folks, that's key for the data to be accessible, to be well interpreted, and then to be applied. So the classroom alone, really, really powerful applications there. Next slide. And I am throwing in some screenshots of an SLDS that we just learned about through SETDA. The state of Indiana was generous enough to offer insight into their GPS dashboard, and their GPS acronyms stands for Graduates Preparing to Succeed. So I just threw in a couple of screenshots from Indiana's interface, having worked with consultants to be able, so folks who haven't really seen what SLDS can look like in practice can kind of begin to envision what it does. So I know the screenshot here is a little bit blurry here, but it allows folks to drill down on student data, to be able to look at student performance over time. And again, this is an actual screenshot from Indiana's interface. And I think that the Project Unicorn team will be able to add their link into the chat for folks that want to take a look at their SLDS interface. Next slide. So we can kind of zoom up from the individual classroom or school building level, and we can think about managed data, being able to tell stories and inform decisions at the district level, right? So we can look at trends between grades. We can look at impact and correlation and connection between different school schedules, different staffing models, the impact of different professional learning systems that are set up. But by zooming out of the classroom, again, data can inform decisions at the district level. And once again, as mentioned from the classroom slide, having data standards that allows data to flow well is essential. So mentioning the different data standards that can provide a common framework and allow data to flow. Next slide. This is another screenshot that I borrowed from Indiana, but just it gives you, again, a sense and a snapshot of the kinds of data, the kinds of stories and information that a well-designed and well-implemented statewide longitudinal data system can inform. So we're able to look at trends across grades, across buildings, et cetera, and then make decisions using that information. Next slide. And last, and this is where SETDA's wheelhouse, when we zoom up to the state level, we think again about the power that this information can inform folks like our two speakers, Daniel and Nicholas today, who work at the state level. And when we hand the mic to them, they'll be able to speak about their experience and how statewide longitudinal data systems equip them to be able to look at statewide trends to inform policy and program implementation, et cetera, and also supporting them as they ensure compliance with federal requirements. Next slide. I think I've just got two more. We'll stay at this slide just for one more moment. Again, from Indiana's dashboard, if you look at literally the sort of the gauge there, the marker, you're able to see what the state goal is and where the state currently is. So this is another way to sort of zoom up, to look at benchmarks, to reflect on where there's progress, to be able to identify where there may be challenges in place, and then to bring people together to the table to be able to figure out how to navigate any challenges that may present. I'm going to pause there. That's just another interface for Indiana. And again, I'm plugging them because they're top of mind and they gave a great demo. And again, in the chat, I think we'll be able to share a link to their system. So if folks want to reach out and get in touch and ask questions or learn more, at SETDA, we love to be able to create those connections and opportunities for people to come together and learn. I think that's it for me for now.
Thank you for that, Sarah. We would also like to mention that we have a 4-part resource series done in collaboration with SETDA on our website surrounding interoperability and the SLDS, ensuring interoperability, using cooperative strategies for state building and R&D infrastructure, federal funding braiding to support data-driven instruction work, and envisioning success with the modernization of statewide longitudinal data systems and federal funding policy. And we've also provided the link in the chat if you'd like to read up on it and learn more about that work. Now we will hear from two state leaders who have experience with SLDS and interoperability. Again, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A at any point during the webinar.
Hi, I'm Dan Rallier. I'm the director of the Office of Research and Data Analysis for the South Carolina Department of Education.
And I'm Nicholas Hanville, Chief Data and Privacy Officer at the Georgia Department of Education. In that capacity, I work closely really with the full education data stack that we have at the state agency. We collect the data from districts, push data up to the feds as part of our state reporting and federal reporting. We've been going through over the last few years a major overhaul of that whole system, and SLDS is front and center and a core part of that long-term vision. So looking forward to interacting with all of you this morning or this afternoon and talking a lot more about SLDS and its critical role in the world of ed data.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel Nicholas. We're going to get into the questions prepared for our speakers today. So how has the SLDS impacted the education programs in your state? Daniel, we can start with you.
So I want to back up just a second and talk about SLDS as the State Longitudinal Data System. That used to be something that was almost separate and distinct, where you were reporting into a fixed system at fixed points in time in order to create snapshots, right? And then you would do some linking or reporting across agencies. With the explosion of technology and at least inside of the education space, and the advent of interoperability has changed the SLDS from a reporting mechanism to an actual tool that impacts day-to-day decision making, whether it's being able to gather data from your health and human services or social services in order to support PEBT and distribution of electronic benefits to students, or you're capturing data about the performance of third graders in order to prepare summer schools, or you're down at the very, very granular level where you're providing state resources in the form of a learning object repository in order to impact the classroom and deliver content to schools. So this thing that used to be thought of as a reporting layer is now a dynamic part of support services for students, classroom delivery mechanisms, reporting across the districts as we tie IEPs into your Ed5 ODS and be able to look at IEP outcomes in close to real time against your assessment data. So the whole system through interoperability has gone from this discrete layering to a interactive dynamic system statewide. So picking a particular program is a challenge, right? There's actually a listing of them, whether you're leveraging EdFi in order to deliver research practices to the classroom through your rostering system, or you're leveraging One Ed Tech in order to provide rosters back to vendors to link your SIS components to to the people who make phone calls to homeless students in order to make sure that they're feeling contact with their schools. So we've changed, or we're seeing that change from a static reporting system to something that starts to impact almost every component of school.
And I'll add to that, if we go back to the early 2000s in the world of K-12 education, we saw this gradual and yet all at once explosion of education data, right? Data specifically about students. And it happened in a very organic way, which has its own benefit. But it was also a lot of different environments that were evolving very much in isolation. So you had different spaces like special education data, student information systems, all these different places that kind of said, wait a second, we've got these new platforms, we've got these new opportunities where we can really begin to pull together data to support education. And as that happened, I think nationally we began to realize there really was no single pane of glass through which educators could really look at those data and make them actionable, right? And so Georgia initially received an SLDS grant back in 2009, and some states go back even further, a few years before that. And I think really, as the federal government funded this SLDS work, there was a realization that we were making a transformation in education where, let's call it prior to 2000, roughly, educators were desperate for data. How do I find data about my students so I can know something about them? And we quickly went from struggling to collect and identify data to now we have the exact opposite problem where there's way too much. And so SLDS became a way in most states, I'd probably all of them, where we could begin to pull those data into that single pane of glass and help educators from the state level, the district level, the school level, the classroom level to make sense out of that huge mountain range of data. And I think it's critical to understand that the underlying value proposition, in my eyes, of SLDS is the bringing together of those data and supporting the creation of insights to then make that actionable. And I think that's really, when we talk about SLDS, it's so much more than a platform. It is that vision that every educator across the ecosystem of a state's SLDS should not have to spend 30 hours a week diving into Excel spreadsheets, trying to make sense of the disparate locations where they have data. There's the world of the education data geeks and nerds like Dan and myself who build things to support practitioners. And then there's practitioners. And we increasingly have been focused on, let's let the practitioners practice. Let's let them be teachers. Let's let them be principals. They don't need to be data miners. They don't need to spend hour after hour trying to find a way to make meaning out of data. That's our job as the geeks and the nerds to really do that for them, to support the attainment of those insights so they can then quickly enact better policies as administrators, enact better practices as teachers and principals. And I think that's, for me, whenever I think about the core mission of SLDS, it's exactly that. How do we support educators from the state school superintendent all the way down to a teaching assistant in a classroom? How do we make sure that that entire ecosystem, every turn where we can, we're supporting those educators with the right data, the right way at the right time to support that better practice, that better data-informed decision-making?
Well, it's actually getting interesting, right? Because now we're starting to look cross-agency and connecting early childhood and Head Start in order to see their outcomes in third grade. SETDS has opened up a new world where we start looking across those, what used to be siloed domain, and start to chisel through, right? Connecting to post-secondary, looking at educator workforce data, and branching into early learning. We're starting to see cross-domain movement through a series of useful tools.
Awesome. Thank you, Daniel and Nicholas, for that. The next question we have is, how can states ensure that the insights extracted from the SLDS data are effectively translated into actionable strategies to improve student educational outcomes?
Wow, that's a big job, right? But I also think it's an iterative job where you start educating people about how to consume data, finding the meaningful data points to share in order to make their lives easier. So I don't think it's a flip the switch solution. I think it's an iterative one as people get used to consuming data and making decisions based on it, right? So knowing what program a child came from or is going to, and then having some depth of knowledge about that program, right? So first you identify that commonality of they came from this, right? And then you start learning about this in order to say, how can I impact their outcomes now? So it's a matter of learning what the data are telling you and getting a sense of what's available and what's valuable.
And I'm going to pivot from your question just a little bit in my answer, because I actually think there's a step before that of, okay, now I've got insight. How do I then really make sure that the practice in which I'm engaging is optimized, right? The biggest challenge we have, that Dan and I have in our world of the data nerds and the data geeks, right, is how do we even go from data to insight? How do we build systems like SLDS? I'm not picking on any states, and Georgia's been as guilty of this as any, so I'm not pointing fingers, but early days of SLDS, we were very guilty of giving people back data in really big tables, right? Well, that's only all you've done is aggregate data at a way that there's no insight there unless you spend hour after hour like a forensic accountant, digging through those tables. And so I think the biggest challenge is in the world of data in general. There's the idea that it's the data to wisdom pyramid or hierarchy, right? You start with data. You have to find a way to turn data into information. Once you've turned it into information, how do you then support users in gaining knowledge and gaining insight from those data? And when they combine the knowledge and the insight that they get from your product, an SLDS dashboard, an application, with their years of experience as practitioners, you then have wisdom, right? The coming together of the skills and the knowledge that they've acquired as experts in their field with the insights, you now have wisdom, right? And I think that's the biggest challenge for us before we even get to how do you go from insight to wisdom and practice. We've got to make sure that we're paying a lot of attention to how do we go from data to information to insight / knowledge. And I think that really one of the places that I've been very happy to see is a central focus these days among vendors, among school districts and state education agencies and the feds is that piece, right? This realization that we cannot have products that really just push information out there. We have to support that next step of information to insight. And I think that's critical. And as we get that well, then it's about partnering with practitioners, whether those are school and district and state staff or the various nonprofit sectors, right? Because Dan's a really smart guy. I like to think that I'm smart, but we're not experts in classroom instruction. And so that next step of how do you use the insight gained from our products to really optimize teaching? And well, we're not going to be able to tell teachers how to do that, but we can partner with them to make sure the products that we build support that as best we can. And so I think really you're talking about a much larger group of stakeholders who have to come together and support that work.
I think we're getting better at it, though, Nicholas, as we move from those large spreadsheets to visualizations, right? So we're seeing an industry that's growing, or at least the education portion of that industry is getting a lot stronger about how do we make that transition to meaningful visualizations that convey a sense without people spending the extended time to do that translation. So we're getting better.
We used to pat ourselves on the back because we created a pie chart, and now we realize that's not helping anybody. We've got to provide more meaningful visualizations and more meaningful platforms.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Daniel, Nicholas. I think it's important that you guys pointed out the iterative solution and that it's insight to wisdom. It's not just a step-by-step process or a one-step process. Thank you for clarifying that. The next question we have here, could you provide an overview of how the SLDS supports decision-making at various levels within the education system, in the classroom, vertically, and across state agencies horizontally?
Well, I can say a little bit about how we're preparing to do that, right? So in the same way that we built out utilizing some of the One Ed Tech tools and rostering, we're able to get something as simple as usage data and knowing what's being consumed and how it's being delivered, leveraging LTI to say, all right, this is how many people are hitting this particular piece of digital content, or utilizing this particular tool out of the LMS inventory, and then being able to look for correlation, if not causation, between outcomes or changes in outcomes using more advanced analytics around their growth data to say, all right, what can we see in the commonalities between what's being delivered in the classroom and what outcomes? So I think you're seeing a set of tools that are being developed about that pretty rapidly, and you're seeing interoperability playing a large role in delivering that information.
And I'll just say that Dan is actually being very humble because South Carolina right now is doing very innovative work in how a state agency can really support down to the classroom level, doing some really creative work with some of their partners in that space. And it's something that we're continuing to learn from them in Georgia in terms of exactly, Aaron, what you asked here, right? Even as a state education agency, for most state education agencies around the country, historically, we've been about compliance, right? How do we make sure the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, everything that the feds require, the state requires, that's our role. And you've begun to see this transformation. It started before COVID, but especially since then, that we need to be partners in this work. And especially in the world of data, how do we at the state, we collect this whole mountain range. We used to say we collect a mountain of data, and then we step back and realize it's really a mountain range, right? Because there's so much data we collect over time on so many different areas. How do we push that back to the classroom, the principal, district leaders, to support that decision making, right? And so I think in Georgia, and really in most states, Indiana being a leader in that space, Sarah, as you showed with the work they're doing with GPS. But most states are going through a transformation right now of saying, as great as SLDS is, in many ways, it's still kind of the legacy of the compliance orientation of state agencies. And as we become about both compliance, but also about service and support, SLDS has to evolve to really meet those new needs. In Georgia, we have school districts that, because of their size and economies of scale and sophistication, they rival the capacity of any local education agency in the country in terms of what they do around data. But most of our school districts have one or two people across the entire district who really can focus on data. So imagine what we can do at the state level to build one dashboard for all of them instead of each small district or state charter school having to build that for themselves. The other piece that, Dan, I don't think you spoke to directly, but the idea of cross state agencies. That is something, in fact, it was written into by the feds, the most recent round of SLDS grants, right? How are you going to further interagency collaboration? I think that's something that we're realizing in Georgia. We've got to be able to better leverage our platform not just to support K-12 educators, but also all these other all these other agencies in the state that are kind of adjacent to the lives and the work of students and educators. And one of the big challenges, to kind of throw a wrench into all of that, but a very important wrench, is you have to find the right balance between transparency, especially when you're talking about PII, personally identifiable information on students. There's a balance here between privacy and trying to have these interoperable systems, right? In a technically optimal or technologically optimal world, we would have data flowing in every direction all day across all these agencies, but we can't do that because there are federal laws, there are simple common sense decisions that have to be made to say, wait a minute, this is data on 13-year-old people. Do we really want that flowing to 7 different agencies? And so how do we find the right balance legally and just in terms of common sense for where we can share data versus where do we need to say there's a very legitimate need for this agency to not have access to this data? And I will not claim in Georgia that we have figured out that balance perfectly, but probably on a weekly, at least monthly basis, we're having conversations internally and with other agencies about how to strike that right balance.
So, Nicholas, again, I think you're being a little bit modest. Georgia and North Carolina are both engaged in a match program, right, where they have looked at across all of their colleges and found out what the entrance criteria would be, and then are using that student level data to match against the criteria and then sending back to their students the schools that they would be qualified to enter, right? And that contain programs that they're interested in. So it's not sharing from Georgia DOE to the colleges directly, but it's using the information from both to enable their stakeholders. And then a student gets a letter or a QR code or something. Nicholas can tell you about it, but they bring up a personalized web page where they can say, hey, you're qualified to go to one of these 4 schools. The student clicks the school that sends some contact information to the registrar at the school. Correct me if I've got it wrong. And then they have an interactive process from that point on where student knows they have a seat potentially at that school. School is then able to leverage the records the student sends in order to find proper fit. So we are looking at cross-agency use in order to support stakeholders in a very, very dynamic way. I saw that there was a question about funding available to individual districts. So yes, kind of. For individual districts, you see the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation support the EdFi platform, which allows a point of integration across your different systems, right? We have partners in PowerSchool and PCG and other that have embraced interoperability and enable that kind of centralized data system at the district level. And then you have other partners that are building open source data warehouses. So it's not that there's necessarily an all-encompassing platform. You're seeing movers and shakers in the industry embracing interoperability that allows you to make this work at a reasonable cost where you can choose what makes it go in your district.
Thank you for that, Daniel. And that brings us to our next question, which is how can states ensure that the SLDS remains a dynamic and responsive tool that meets the evolving needs of the education system?
Well, so there's a difference, and as technologists, we're guilty of this. We treat the world in series of projects, right? Where you take a large bolus of funds, you run through a project management scape from beginning to end, right? Well, there's no end to interoperability because data changes. There's no end to your longitudinal data system because it's a dynamic system. This really needs to be treated as a program where there's a continuous constant investment in sustainability, re-education about the use cases or the things that we want to accomplish. We have constant flocks, or hopefully flocks of new teachers being brought in that need to either be taught how to consume this data when they're in their education preparation programs, or have a professional development series that are available either through the states or through districts, depending on capacity, in order to teach people how to use it. So this isn't a once and done. This isn't a, all right, build it, let it break down, and then have another CPR session. This is a constant, continuous investment in maintaining a system, whether it's through iterations of the SED standards. I believe they have a new version coming out, or iterations on EdFi, or even iterations on OneRoster. So the interoperability space is moving, which means the technology across our vendor partners and across the state system needs to evolve with it. So it's not a project, it's a program, and it's a constant reinvestment.
And Aaron, I know you have other questions you want to get to, so I think Dan's answer was a great one. I'll give you a very short and succinct answer from my side. And that is, I think historically, state agencies in education and elsewhere have been guilty of having the typical government monopoly kind of mentality, right? And we built what we thought people needed, and they didn't really have a choice but to use what we created. So it didn't really matter, right? And I think especially, again, this is something that was beginning to change pre-COVID, but COVID became a catalyst. There is an expectation of government that we be responsive to the needs of citizens, that we be responsive to the needs of practitioners. And so my simple answer then is, we have to engage with our stakeholders who are users of SLDS platforms, whether those are vendors, classroom teachers, any other stakeholder, and make sure we understand what they need. And as long as we keep building what they need, how they need it, this work will be successful. But if we build what we think they need without them really being involved in that identification process, then I think a lot of states will struggle in materializing the long-term vision of SLDS.
Thank you, Daniel Nicholas. Our next question: what measures are in place to ensure equitable access to and use of SLDS data across districts and schools?
Well, in order for access to exist, the thing has to be there, right? So I think step one is to build a dynamic system that supports continuous access. And then I believe that by making the data useful at the stakeholder level, right, you improve data quality, right? So a lot of the reporting, you know what, if I was wrong by 3% or 5%, it's just going to the state, or it's just going to the feds, right? It didn't matter in the day-to-day. But when you build a foundation on a transactional system, and the reporting and the data that are in there on the day-to-day actually are reflected in the classroom, teachers get mad if your rosters aren't right, right? Parents get angry if the assignments aren't being reported in a timely fashion. People, by building the demand, right, you actually perpetuate the continued use of the system. But when you go out and they don't, I think what you're really asking about is what is the state role in supporting that infrastructure in a statewide level so that you don't have places where haves and have-nots to the same degree. And there's always going to be communities with more resources than others, right? But what do you do to raise the floor so that everybody has a minimum level of access to the information? And I think that's the role of the state system.
Yeah, and when I think about this question in terms of SLDS, I think about the disparities that exist between and among LEAs, districts. As I said earlier, I mean, we've got districts here in Georgia that if SLDS disappeared, if the Georgia Department of Education never did anything around data visualization, providing data, they would be just fine. But the vast majority of our districts, in fact, I think our median size is about median size school district is about 3,000 students. Most of our LEAs, most of our school districts, even though they have access, it's not the challenge here is not an access. It's a, do I have the people who know how to, going back to that data to wisdom hierarchy, right? Do I have people on staff who have the skill set, who have the experience in helping us to take this information and really feed it into our decision making? You go to some of the Atlanta metro area school districts, they have data strategists who go out and work with principals, work with, other educators throughout the school system to make sure that they know how to do that work, right? The equity challenge here is not one of access, it's one of implementation. And I think I don't think we're doing a great job of that yet, but one of the core things we're focusing on as we really evolve our SLDS into the near future state is emphasizing data utilization. So we build all these products that live within this ecosystem, within this platform called SLDS. It's the running joke that we've had the last few years is this is not the field of dreams. Just because you build a dashboard doesn't mean they'll show up, doesn't mean that they'll know how to use it, doesn't mean that it will have the value proposition that you believe it will. And so we've really, as a state agency, have to support through training, through resources, classroom teachers, principals, special education directors, whomever it may be in a school system, to be able to do that work. You have access, but it's not valuable unless you can actually make it valuable. And so how do we address the disparity there in terms of staff capacity? And that's something that I think SLDS plays an essential role in leveling the playing field there among district staff.
Awesome. Beautifully said, Nicholas and Daniel. We will move on to the Q&A portion of this webinar. We have a few minutes to take questions from the attendees. Please put any questions in the chat box. We did have a question come in. What are the biggest technology challenges you are facing in your respective SLDS implementations?
Data governance, which is probably the largest. The challenge is not, well, all right, to a certain degree, there's challenges in the technology as we move to systems that weren't designed around interoperability, but have tried to evolve into interoperability. So there's always friction at the interface where that's changing. And until we start seeing systems that were developed around the concept of interoperability as part of their native core, right? And I believe that's the next generation that is going to be that you're going to be seeing as people who have said, okay, this has been around enough that this is the lingua franca, and we're going to build our APIs and our structures around it rather than try and shoehorn into it. But the biggest problem we have is for me is data governance, right? The idea of how do you allow latitude of choice across 100 different units and still have them come together in a way that allows it to be truly interoperable across it. When you say student ID, how do I make sure that they're not thinking the DC ID that they're used for the internal system, the student number that they issued in the district, the badge number that they got associated, or the state unique student number, right? Which student number, which student ID, and just coming to simple agreements around things like that can be a challenge, because if you have fast adopters, they've made some choices, and when they don't align, you end up trying to back into it.
And I know we have a few more questions that have come in, so I will be very succinct so we can get to those as well. I'm going to cheat, Mike, with my answer. You asked about the technology challenges. I'm going to cheat a bit and say, actually, co-sign everything Dan said for sure, especially data governance. But the biggest challenges in terms of going from the old state to the future state from a technology standpoint is change management and supporting your people, right? As you go from an on-prem environment to the cloud, as you migrate from the old way of doing things to the new, there's a lot of change for our staff. There's a lot of change for principals. There's a lot of, right? And we try to minimize the degree to which this disrupts any of our users or our platform SLDS users or any of our external stakeholders, but it does disrupt them. As we do, the interoperability is critical work. It needs to be done, but it's very disruptive for that period of time where Dan has talked about the alignment of these different platforms, right? That causes a little bit of discomfort and angst and anxiety for people. And so as you do this work as a vendor, as an agency, as anyone involved in that ecosystem, people, technology, processes, right? Like it goes back to those three and being able to really support people through that transition.
Thank you, Nicholas and Daniel. Next question we have, I work in Illinois and it seems like a lack of state agency involvement is leading to a lack of progress with EdFi and data interoperability. Any advice for this type of situation?
So part of that I think goes to size, though. Georgia, you're seeing a lot of work in Texas. You're seeing Georgia. You're starting to see states of particular size, right? That's saying, look, making this transition is important to the future of our program. Problem happens is when you have things, states that have things that are working, maybe aren't great, but they're not feeling the pain of the breakdown of systems yet. I mean, it's going to happen, right? Because the world is evolving, right? And I think that you reach a critical mass inside the state where either policymakers or state leaders say, all right, now it's time to bite the bullet and start that transition, right? I know some states that are still operating on mainframes, much less having made the transition to a cloud environment. So I think it's coming, right? I think that's where the system is moving to, but I think there has to be for large players. I think it has to have a lot of internal pressure and champions in order to get it across the finish line.
I don't know who asked the question, but I will say if I had a good answer for you, I would be a nationally renowned professor of applied federalism. There's always a tension. Any of this type of work, there's always a tension between and among the local level, the state level, the federal level. On our best days, we're in alignment and we've got a clear vision, and then it's about how do we get there. And on our worst days, there's a lot of back and forth. Even in Georgia, as great a relationship as we have with our LEAs, there's a lot of them that look at us and saying, like a lot of what Dan talked about earlier, hey, this old way or current way of doing things works. Why are you messing up my whole flow, right? And so I think it goes back to the answer I gave to the last question. success in this work is not just about implementing technological solutions. It's about people. And people aren't always going to be in alignment in terms of what the vision is.
Thank you, Nicholas and Daniel. We do have a couple minutes left, so I will try to ask these questions a little faster. How have you implemented early warning systems with SLDS, EWS flags, those data markers that may indicate a student in academic or personal distress?
So a lot of times I'm faced with making a choice between where is my border and where is the prerogatives of the district, right? And what we've done here is we've built out a layered system where you have an EdFi ODS in every district and a district data governance group that goes through and sets the priorities for the visualizations that are consumed at the district level. So I'm aware of work around providing visualizations off of an EdFi-enabled data warehouse. And I know that they are building visualizations that contain those early warning systems, but that is not happening at the state level.
And for us in Georgia, we are actually piloting right now a state-built early warning system that will be integrated into SLDS. And so more to come on that.
Amazing, amazing. The last question we have, are third-party education technology developers able to utilize de-identified data from South Carolina or Georgia SLDS to inform EdTech development and or fine-tune LLMs to understand student experiences, trajectories that lead to positive outcomes?
So I'm not at a point in my understanding or comfort level where I would allow even large-scale de-identified data into an LLM. Perhaps in a protected environment, I would work with an internal model, but until I receive clear guidance from our policymakers that they want that kind of exposure, I guess, for lack of a better word. So I think the AI is great. I think it's going to find a place, but its place is not right now with large-scale student information in South Carolina.
Yeah, and I can't give a direct answer because it would really depend on that specific request. But I will say, again, it goes back to the idea of we have to balance the desire to grow the world of AI and data to support practitioners and students against the need to really respect student privacy. So we have have had for many years a student data privacy review board that reviews all these types of requests and really makes a determination, not just, but certainly based on FERPA and state law, but also based on, is this an acceptable risk for us to give data, even de-identified data on students? We have a very high threshold for that. And we're in the process of building a parallel AI ethics committee as well to be able to say, not just are we willing to share the data, but is this something that we feel is an ethical use of student data as relates to AI? And so that's a capacity and an additional buffer there that we're looking to build out over the next few years.
I'm within 24 hours.
Same. The last question. Go, Aaron, we jumped the gun because we know we're against time. If you want to actually read the question for everybody.
No, that was perfect. My hope is that you would see it and answer it. But thank you. I'm glad we were able to squeeze that last question in. As we start to wrap up this webinar, Please visit our website, projectunicorn.org, to learn more about our project and to stay up to date with our latest news, resources, publications, as well as webinars. Okay. Thank you again for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been informative and addressed any questions you may have about the SLDS and interoperability in its role in education. Thank you to our speakers. We appreciate you taking your time out to be a part of this webinar and offering your insight and knowledge around the subject. We hope you all enjoy the rest of your Monday, and thank you again for joining.
Thank you, everyone.